You are standing in a glittering ballroom, chandeliers shimmer overhead, velvet drapes ripple from the breeze, and courtiers in powdered wigs whisper behind fans, but beneath the layers of brocade and corset steel, you feel it, pressure building. Urgent, unforgiving, you cannot excuse yourself. You cannot show weakness. You cannot leave, because you are a queen, and the court is always watching, so you nod gracefully to a duchess, and relieve yourself in silence, without a single expression crossing your painted face. How did royalty manage to relieve themselves in full view of servants, rivals, and entire courts, while preserving every ounce of dignity? This is not a story about toilets, it's a story about control, about the rules of visibility and the lengths power goes to in order to hide its most human truths, and it all begins with a royal chamber pot. You were raised to believe they were untouchable, kings in crimson robes, queens in gowns stitched with pearls. They moved through the world like living paintings, serene, divine, above the noise of need. You imagined them drinking wine from crystal goblets, riding through rose gardens, dining beneath gold ceilings, but you never imagined them squatting. You never pictured a duchess lifting her skirts, or a prince grimacing through stomach cramps during a state dinner. That was the magic of monarchy, not just power, but the erasure of all that was human, and yet their bodies didn't care. Their intestines churned, their bladders filled, their bowels ached just like yours, but the court demanded silence, dignity, majesty. In a world where sneezing without elegance could be noted in court diaries, where bodily odor was considered political weakness, where the slightest display of physical need was a crack in the image, the most ordinary functions became the most dangerous. This wasn't just a matter of embarrassment, it was theater. Monarchs were not people. They were symbols, living myths, and myths, of course, don't need to urinate. But the truth was far less glamorous. In Versailles, the most powerful man in Europe, the Sun King, used a chamber pot inches from his silk-draped throne. In Georgian England, a queen could relieve herself mid-ball in front of dozens of courtiers, and no one would flinch. In fact, if they flinched, they would be punished, because dignity wasn't about what happened, it was about pretending it didn't. The palace didn't erase the body, it mastered it. It choreographed the illusion. What you're about to uncover isn't just about how royalty used the toilet. It's about how they turned defecation into ritual, how the most basic act of humanity became the ultimate display of control. Imagine walking into a gilded chamber, gold-leafed mirrors, velvet canopies, lace-draped windows, and finding, at the center of it all, a commode disguised as a throne. Not metaphorically, literally. Beneath a velvet cushion lay a porcelain bowl, next to it, a perfumed cloth, and beside that, a servant with gloved hands, trained not just in etiquette, but in discretion. This wasn't scandal, it was ceremony. In many royal courts, relieving oneself wasn't a hidden act, it was part of daily ritual. The French had a word for it, la chaise percée, the pierced chair. The English called it the close stool, an ornate wooden box with a velvet seat and hidden chamber pot. At Versailles, King Louis XIV conducted morning audiences while seated on his toilet, legs apart beneath layers of brocade, nobles entering the room to discuss war, taxation, or matters of faith, while pretending not to notice the unmistakable scent of digestion. But it wasn't the royals who were expected to look away, it was everyone else. Pretending was not just encouraged, it was enforced. Eyes were trained to wander, conversations rose to drown out the sound, servants were taught to bow while holding a soiled linen. To flinch was treason, to blush was weakness. And yet, this elaborate charade wasn't rooted in arrogance, it was rooted in fear. The court was a cage lined with velvet. Royals knew they were always being watched, every breath they took, every movement of their hand, all of it recorded by scribes, echoed in rumors, etched in letters sent across kingdoms. There was no privacy, so instead, they forged a new kind of invisibility, ritualized denial. To rule meant to be worshipped, but to be worshipped, you had to appear flawless. And so, every foul smell, every gurgle of the gut, every trace of sweat, it all had to be erased, masked, or transformed. Into elegance, the court didn't remove the body, it rewrote its rules. To the world, they were paragons of purity, perfumed, powdered, and painted into godlike stillness. But behind the embroidered walls of royal chambers, hygiene was a strange and dangerous game. Baths were rare, often feared. Doctors warned that too much bathing might open the pores and let death in. So instead of washing, they layered on scent, orange blossom oils, rose water, ambergris, and vinegar-soaked cloths meant to smother the odor of skin and excrement alike. The royal body became an altar, not to health, but to appearance. The body's functions didn't stop. They were simply masked, beautified, ritualized. A queen might wear gowns so elaborate that her ladies had to hold her upright to relieve herself, under her skirts, in silence, while continuing a conversation about court alliances. A prince could be mid-hunt, dismount, relieve himself in the bushes beside a nobleman, and return to the saddle without breaking the rhythm of command. None of this was vulgar, it was expected, but it had to be done correctly. Etiquette manuals quietly outlined how to excuse a faint odor, how to signal a need for the chamber pot without disrupting a salon. Servants learned the precise moment to enter, to bow, to remove the waste, all without looking the royal in the eye. Even the chamber pots themselves were status symbols: silver, porcelain, some shaped like delicate swans or carved with family crests. They weren't toilets, they were trophies, but underneath the choreography, something darker pulsed: shame. Because the more divine a monarch was expected to be, the more dangerous their own humanity became. A single slip, a visible stain, a groan, an accident, could trigger whispers, mockery, or worse, especially for queens. A woman who lost control of her body could lose her power entirely. So every morning began with a lie, the illusion that this body, this human flesh, did not sweat or stink or strain. It simply existed perfectly, but beneath every crown, every gown, every powdered wig, the truth sat quietly in a porcelain bowl. There were rules for how to walk, rules for how to eat, but there were also rules, unspoken, strict, and deeply rehearsed, for how to relieve oneself when draped in velvet and watched by 20 people. The close stool wasn't just a seat with a hidden pot, it was a ritual object, carried in and out by specially appointed servants, placed at a precise angle, warmed with linen if necessary, and always scented with herbs or vinegar. This was not about comfort, it was about concealment. For the monarch, there was no privacy, especially not in the morning. The first moments of a royal day were called the lever, a ceremonial rising, during which nobles, advisors, and family members entered the chamber to greet the sovereign as they were dressed, or, more accurately, as they voided their bowels. In France, King Louis XIV routinely received courtiers while seated over his commode. His physician stood nearby, noting color, texture, frequency, a royal diary written in feces, but no one flinched, because pretending not to see was part of the performance. Even more striking was the British tradition, where Queen Elizabeth I and later monarchs had their stools built into furniture, disguised beneath lace and embroidery. They were called into use mid-conversation, a handkerchief gesture, a shift in position, and suddenly, the monarch was relieving themselves. As you listened to their thoughts on marriage treaties or religious reforms, yet the court didn't laugh, didn't whisper, because this was the dance. You were to admire the grace with which they ignored their body's needs, or rather, the grace with which they performed them without breaking character, and if they did it wrong. If the odor escaped, if the sound echoed, it wasn't just embarrassment, it was political failure. A ruler who lost control of their body, even for a moment, risked losing the illusion of control altogether. So servants lit incense, musicians played louder, nobles spoke in high, amused tones, and the monarch remained still. It wasn't just the monarch who had to follow the rules. It was everyone around them, the servants, the ladies in waiting, the advisors and foreign guests. They had to learn the language of silence. They had to know when to look away, how to breathe through their mouths, when to pretend the sound they'd just heard was a creak in the floorboards, not a bodily function. In the great palaces of Europe, denial became a form of loyalty. There were codes for everything. A lady-in-waiting might gently fan the queen not out of courtesy, but to mask assent. A nobleman might bow not in reverence, but to discreetly exit the room while the king excused himself without ever rising. Servants were trained to interpret the smallest gestures, a hand on the stomach, a raised eyebrow, and respond with clockwork precision. If they did it right, the act remained invisible. If they hesitated, they could be dismissed, or worse, humiliated in front of the court for drawing attention to what must never be acknowledged. Some monarchs turned it into a power play. Louis XIV famously allowed select courtiers to attend his morning toilet as a sign of favor. It wasn't a punishment, it was a privilege. To watch the king defecate meant you were part of his inner circle. You could whisper in his ear while he sat on the commode. You could shape policy while he passed waste. And somehow, that intimacy didn't degrade him, it elevated you. But for queens, the rules were crueler. A female body was already suspect. Fragile, messy, too easily disrupted by nature. If a queen showed discomfort, if she stained her gown, if she fainted from holding too long, it became not just personal, but political. Her femininity, her fertility, her composure, all of it was tied to how flawlessly she could pretend nothing was happening at all. The court had no mercy for cracks in the illusion, and the body was nothing but cracks, so they sealed them with perfume, protocol, and perfected denial. The closer you look, the more absurd it becomes. In the most magnificent rooms of European palaces, beneath frescoed ceilings and silk wall panels, hidden compartments were built into armchairs and side tables, not to store jewels, but to catch urine. Chamber pots were tucked behind curtains, screens were unfolded with choreographed grace. In the middle of a concert, a noble might step behind a folding divider, relieve themselves, then return without disrupting a single note. The show must always go on, but someone always had to clean it, and so palace architects developed tricks, angled hallways, decoy doors, hidden trapdoors in the floor, to whisk away the physical evidence without drawing attention. Pipes in Versailles emptied waste from upper floors through secret chutes. Servants moved like shadows, summoned by the faintest bell. Linen cloths were presented and folded into pleats to absorb sound and smell. Even the windows were strategically placed to let in just enough breeze to carry away shame. Yet, despite all this effort, the truth was hard to hide forever. At times, the scent of waste wafted through marble corridors. During summer, the heat amplified every secret, and on more than one occasion, a visiting ambassador or newly married bride recoiled at the realization that the palace, for all its opulence, reeked faintly of urine, sweat, and lavender. Still, no one dared speak it aloud. The etiquette books didn't explain how to address an accident. They explained how to prevent it from becoming visible. Dignity wasn't about cleanliness, it was about narrative control. A monarch could soil themselves and still be seen as divine, as long as everyone agreed to call it something else. This was the rule behind all the other rules. Reality is not allowed to interrupt the performance, and so the chamber pot became a symbol, not of weakness, but of discipline. The court didn't pretend their rulers had no bodies, they just demanded that the body obey the crown. He wore silk, not rags, carried the king's secrets, not his sword, and yet his duty was as intimate and humiliating as any job in the palace. He wiped the royal bottom. His title was elegant, the groom of the stool, but his reality was not. He was the man who attended to the king's most private moments, the one who handed him the perfumed cloth, who removed the soiled linen, who ensured the chamber pot was emptied without a word or wrinkle of the nose. And yet, he was no common servant. He had access others envied, proximity to the throne, literal and symbolic. In Tudor England, the groom of the stool became one of the most powerful men in court. He was not just a bathroom attendant. He controlled access to the king, managed his daily schedule, overheard private words no chancellor could. Some of them rose to positions of incredible political power, promoted to counselors, granted lands, even knighted. Because in a world where privacy was rare and performance constant, those who saw the monarch at their most vulnerable wielded a dangerous intimacy. But what kind of man accepted that role? What did it do to a person to spend years pretending that nothing was happening, even as they crouched beside the most powerful backside in the realm? It was a strange alchemy. The closer you got to the monarch's flesh, the more invisible you had to become. You saw the sweat, the strain, the failures of the body, but your face had to remain blank. Your silence was your currency. One wrong look, one moment of pity or disgust, and you could be dismissed in disgrace, or worse, become the subject of rumor, accused of betrayal for acknowledging that kings were mortal. To survive, you learned to erase yourself, and in that erasure, you became essential. For queens, the ritual was even more delicate, not because their needs were different, but because they were forbidden from being seen as human at all. A king might grunt, pass gas, even joke during his morning routine, but a queen, her silence had to be absolute, her dignity unbroken, and it was the women closest to her, the maids, the chamber women, the ladies of the bedchamber, who made that illusion possible. Their job was to orchestrate invisibility, to lift heavy skirts, unlace corsets, position the chamber pot, and absorb any trace of shame before it reached the silk curtain. They learned to smile through the scent of waste, to carry stained linens as if they were embroidered towels, to soothe, distract, and clean, all while keeping their eyes respectfully downcast. Some of these women were nobles themselves, appointed not for skill, but for lineage. It was considered an honor to serve the queen in such intimate ways, even if that meant wiping her after childbirth or fetching her discarded pads during her courses. These tasks, though whispered about, were a form of feminine politics. Proximity to the queen's body meant proximity to her trust, and in a court where a look could make or break a reputation, being trusted meant everything. But the cost was high. These women had to give up their own privacy, their own comfort. They could not flinch, could not be ill, could not speak out of turn. They became shadows, visible only when the queen allowed it. And if the queen grew displeased, they could be cast out in an instant, their reputations soiled by the same silence they once upheld. Their hands held secrets, the queen's stomach pains, her irregular bleeding, her moments of weakness, and they never told, because their silence wasn't just about loyalty, it was survival. In a world where even a sigh could be recorded, they learned to hold their breath. There was power in cleaning up after kings, but also danger, because to serve the body was to see the cracks in the crown, and the court didn't like cracks. Some servants became scapegoats the moment something went wrong, a faint stain on the bedsheets, a foul smell in the queen's chamber. The blame rarely touched the monarch. It fell instead on the invisible hands nearby. Maids were dismissed for imagined failings. A chamber pot not emptied fast enough could end a career. Comment about the king's complexion, even in private, could lead to exile. And yet, many stayed, not because they loved the work, but because they understood its strange, twisted power. The closer you were to filth, the closer you were to secrets. You knew which nobleman the queen summoned after dark. You knew when the king's stomach churned before a treaty meeting. You knew who was bleeding too much, who was constipated with fear, who trembled at night when the palace was quiet. It was a quiet archive, kept not in books but in memory, a network of servants who knew everything and said nothing. Some were bribed, some were threatened, but most simply learned that survival in the palace meant becoming a wall, still, silent, absorbing everything and reflecting nothing. And when scandal did erupt, a miscarriage, a secret lover, an illness that couldn't be hidden, it was often a servant's silence that determined how far the damage spread. Some rose from these shadows, becoming confidants, even manipulators behind the scenes. Others vanished without a trace, their names scrubbed from the palace rolls like smudges on porcelain. The court needed them, but could never admit how much. They were the ones who saw the truth of power, not in coronations or victories, but in waste, in weakness, in the moments rulers prayed no one would witness. They witnessed it all, and for that, they were never truly safe. The royal body was not just a vessel of power, it was a battleground. Every inch of it was politicized, measured, laced, starved, and silenced, especially for queens and noblewomen, whose appearance was seen not just as personal but national. And the first thing they learned to surrender was comfort. Corsets cinched waists until breathing became a calculation. Gowns layered so thick they turned every step into a negotiation. Meals were restricted, not just for elegance, but to avoid unsightly bloating. And yet, even with all these precautions, the body refused to fully cooperate. Queens became constipated. For days, sometimes weeks, their insides twisted with anxiety and lace. Doctors would prescribe strange remedies, powdered pearls, crushed beetles, purgative herbs that only made things worse. The court would never admit it, but constipation was one of the quiet epidemics of royal life. One French duchess kept a detailed diary of her digestive troubles, code words for enemas, secret appointments with physicians hidden behind bedroom curtains. A young Austrian princess sent to marry into French royalty wept in her chambers because she couldn't relieve herself for 3 days and didn't know how to ask for help without shame. Her chambermaids, equally inexperienced, simply lit more candles. The body, once praised for its grace, became a source of fear, because every function reminded these women that they were not divine. They were flesh, and flesh betrayed you. It sweated, it smelled, it bloated, bled, sagged, and spilled. So the palace didn't just discipline the body, it turned it into an object of surveillance. A lady-in-waiting once noted how the Queen of England had her stools inspected by physicians daily, not just for health but to calculate her fertility. Was she regular? Was she bleeding? Was there a sign of pregnancy? Even her most private moments weren't hers. A throne was not freedom. It was a porcelain cage, and inside it, the body pulsed, aching for permission to be real. You've seen the portraits, pale-faced queens with calm eyes, lips barely parted, hands draped like silk over polished wood. But what the paintings never show is what happened after the painter left. The collapse, the breath held too long, the dizziness behind the smile. Feigning became so common among royal women that it was nearly a fashion. They called it delicacy, hysteria, a sign of refinement. But in reality, it was often the result of pain, the body starving for air beneath a corset drawn tight since dawn, or the lingering effects of laxatives taken before a formal dinner, just to avoid the horror of needing to relieve oneself in public. One courtier wrote of a queen who fainted during mass, not from piety, but from clenching too long, her belly swollen beneath 12 layers of cloth. No one dared help her until the service ended, and even worse was what couldn't be seen: the migraines from dehydration, the infections from poorly cleaned cloths, the burning silence of a body held hostage by the very dignity it was supposed to project. These women were not weak, they were experts in endurance, masters of control. They smiled through stomach cramps and performed through pelvic pain, because anything less than perfection could become political ruin. For young brides, the initiation was brutal. A foreign court, a foreign diet, and no idea how or when it was acceptable to go. Some wrote letters home in panic, not about their husbands, but about digestion. A Habsburg archduchess once confided that she had cried for hours after soiling herself in her sleep. The servants had cleaned it without a word, but the shame never left her. That was the irony. The palace, with all its splendor, gave them everything: jewels, gowns, power, but it took their bodies away, piece by piece, until they belonged not to themselves, but to the image the court demanded. Their bladders waited, their bowels clenched, their lungs pressed against bone, and through it all, they kept smiling. Sometimes, the illusion shattered, and when it did, it wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a crisis of monarchy. One misplaced sound, one visible stain, could spark whispers that rippled across entire courts. A queen's digestion became a matter of national interest, a king's constipation, a source of political speculation. In 18th century France, rumors swirled that Queen Marie Antoinette suffered from chronic stomach cramps and irregularity. Enemies used it against her, mocking her femininity, calling her weak, unfit, unnatural. Her bloating was interpreted not as discomfort, but deceit. Why hadn't she produced an heir yet? Was her body hiding a secret? Each bowel movement, or lack thereof, became fuel for scandal pamphlets. When she finally conceived, it was treated like a miracle, not because of love, but because her digestion had finally aligned with her duty. Even kings weren't safe. King George II of England reportedly died on the toilet, collapsed from an aortic aneurysm while straining. His death became a grotesque punchline, whispered by subjects who had never dared laugh at him in life. The symbolism was too strong to ignore. A monarch, stripped of majesty, and undone by his own body's rebellion. There were accidents at balls, soiled bedsheets hidden before dawn, faint odors ignored in carriages. Each time, the courtiers pretended not to notice, because to notice would be to admit that the divine bled, defecated, and decayed like everyone else. But in private, they spoke. In private, they judged. And yet, for every scandal, there were 100 silences, 100 acts of quiet endurance, 100 queens who clenched through coronations, who wept in private chambers, who learned to time their needs between ceremonies, because they knew the stakes. To be royal wasn't just to rule, it was to perform humanity so well that no one ever suspected how hard it was to hide. Every day began the same way, with the closing of a door and the opening of a ritual, a maid folding fresh linen, a servant lighting a clove-scented taper, a monarch lowering themselves, slowly, onto a velvet-lined commode while two, sometimes, three people stood within arm's reach, not speaking, not watching, and yet seeing everything. It was a strange paradox. This empire of eyes trained not to look, this palace full of ears trained not to hear. In the heart of absolute power, rulers were most exposed. Every cough, every flush of the cheek, every pause too long was a risk. Even the body's silence could be dangerous. A constipated king was a distracted king. A menstruating queen was a vulnerable queen. One misstep, and the illusion fractured. So, they declared war, not against enemies at their borders, but against the very idea of being seen as biological. They sat on thrones carved with lions while squatting over porcelain. They smiled at courtiers while battling nausea. They received ambassadors while their insides twisted in agony, and the system rewarded them for it, for masking, for pretending, for obeying the sacred code. Never let the court see the crack in the marble. This wasn't just personal, it was generational. Queens taught their daughters how to fast before formal banquets. Kings trained their sons to clench through 3-hour ceremonies. Children were raised in the art of stillness, taught not just how to rule, but how to vanish inside their own skins. And the court applauded, because a monarch who did not sweat, who did not smell, who did not defecate, could be worshipped without fear. The lie had become the law, but no matter how tight the corset, how thick the perfume, how obedient the silence, the body never fully disappeared. It waited, beneath the silk, behind the curtain, in the shadow of the crown, ready, one day, to betray its master. They called themselves divine, God-appointed, eternal, but in the silent corners of their palaces, their bodies told a different story. Underneath the powdered wigs and jeweled robes, rot had already begun, teeth blackened from sugar-laced diets, gums bled, bowels swelled from inactivity and anxiety, urine darkened with infection, and through it all, they smiled, because to show discomfort was to admit mortality. By the late 1700s, palace walls in places like Versailles and Schönbrunn held more than secrets. They held a stink, not because there were no chamber pots, but because there were too many. Nobles relieved themselves in fireplaces, on stairwells, behind curtains, too proud or too desperate to wait for a servant. The scents were masked with incense, but never erased. The palaces reeked of rosewater and rot, and still, the pageantry continued. A monarch might sit through hours of court, gut churning with constipation or illness, giving orders with lips that barely parted. A duchess might dance through 4 waltzes, knowing full well she was bleeding beneath her petticoats. But they danced anyway, because breaking character meant breaking the spell. Even in death, the illusion was preserved. Corpses were embalmed quickly, their fluids drained and replaced with oils and spices. Portraits were painted posthumously, to show them glowing and whole, but the truth seeped through letters, diaries, and gossip. The queen who died of infected bowels, the emperor who rotted from the inside while his ministers debated war. No crown could stop the smell of decay. No title could silence the gurgle of sickness. The palace, for all its gold, could not purify the human, but it could hide it. And so, they built a world that punished the body for being real, even as it failed them. Slowly, inevitably, the final betrayal wasn't from enemies or assassins, it came from within. And then, the curtain dropped. The monarch who once ruled a continent now lay in bed, shaking with fever, unable to hold in waste. The same courtiers who once bowed at the chamber door now stood at a distance, their faces pale. Physicians hovered, whispering, linen after linen soaked through and thrown away. No more perfume, no more ceremony, just the raw, unfiltered reality of death. They tried to keep it quiet. The servants doubled their silence. The windows were shut, incense burned in every corner, but nothing could stop the truth from leaking, in scent, in rumor, in the way people walked. Faster down certain halls, the king was dying, and he was dying dirty. One queen, once beloved, died in a pool of her own fluids, surrounded not by family, but by physicians taking notes. Another, once praised for her elegance, had to be sewn into her burial gown because her bowels had ruptured before her final breath. These weren't just deaths, they were the final, violent rupture of the illusion. Even in that moment, the performance didn't end. The official story would describe peaceful passings, noble farewells, a soft sigh as the soul ascended, but those closest knew otherwise. They had seen the struggle, the stench, the fear, the monarch gasping not for air, but for dignity, and then a silence. Not just in the chamber, but across the palace, curtains drawn, bells muffled, the body removed quickly, cleaned, redressed, repainted. Within hours, the fiction resumed. A portrait draped in black, courtiers weeping on cue, a funeral mask sculpted with calm serenity, betraying nothing of the suffering beneath. The throne stood empty, but the close stool remained in the corner, polished, perfumed, and untouched, because, even in death, they could not admit what it meant to be royal, to be watched every day of your life, to be denied your body, to be a god in silk, with no permission to be human. You were told they were untouchable, that kings didn't sweat, and queens didn't bleed, that palaces were clean, fragrant, perfect, that the divine had no need for chamber pots. But now you know better. Behind every silk curtain was a secret. Beneath every jewel gown, a body in chains, a court trained to pretend, servants trained to disappear, monarchs trained to smile through pain, to sit on porcelain thrones while whispering state secrets, to die covered in lace and shame. It wasn't the filth that shocked, it was the silence around it, the unspoken rule that rulers must never be seen as human, that needing relief was weakness, that digestion was scandal, that a single groan could unravel an empire. But maybe that's what power really is, the ability to rewrite even the laws of nature, to sweat and call it perfume, to strain and call it ceremony, to decay and still be declared divine. And yet, in the end, no amount of incense could erase the truth. The body always returns, the body always wins. Asterisk, asterisk. If this story unsettled you, if it made you see history not in gold leaf but in linen stained and quietly carried away, then share it, because every royal face you've ever seen painted in perfect stillness was once held captive by the same needs as yours. Tell us in the comments, what surprised you most about this hidden side of royal life? Would you have survived a day inside a corset, holding everything in, just to keep a crown? If you want more dark, hidden, and human truths from royal history, subscribe, like, and join us for the next untold story, because behind every throne, there's always a shadow.